Doctor, ya podemos comenzar cuando usted quiera.
Bueno, pues muy buenas tardes a todos.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the current panorama of sciences and climate change organized by the Institute of Atmospheric Sciences and Climate Change. Today, this is our second day of activities. We are
Recording
so
in
pleased
progress.
to receive. I was telling you that we are so happy to have as our guest Dr. Debra Wunch from the Physics Department from the Toronto University, and to introduce the overview of her, Dr. Wolfgang will provide us a brief summary of her career. Well, good afternoon. Before I want to advise you to choose English or Spanish according to your preference. Good afternoon. I'm so pleased to introduce Dr. Debra Wunch. She is a physicist from the Toronto University. She also holds a master's degree and a PhD degree in 2007. And she has been working for almost 10 years in Caltech, the Institute of Technology in Pasadena, California, and she supports the training of TCON and in 2016, she came back to the Toronto University as a professor, and in 2020, she was chosen by the chief or representative of TCON, and I am so happy that she has dedicated us the time to give her presentation. And well, we will address some words, and then we will start with the presentation so that we may not have any technical issues. And through the interpreters, we will answer the Q&A session. So I give the floor.
Thanks, Wolfgang. I'm really honored to be here, and thank you to Wolfgang and Michelle for the invitation. So my home internet is not always very stable, so I made the decision to pre-record my lecture so that you can watch it, hopefully without any glitches. But I am here and I'm really happy to be here, and I hope that we have a nice discussion afterwards. I'm happy to take any questions you may have afterwards. And with that, I will hand it back to Wolfgang to play the recording. Thank you very much again. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this year's Panorama conference. I'm excited to tell you about the atmospheric measurements we're collecting in support of carbon cycle research. I would not be able to speak about these measurements if it were not for the efforts of my colleagues around the world, and in particular the members of my research group and our collaborators in Environment and Climate Change Canada, all the TCON partners, including those in attendance today, and the OCO science team and algorithm team members. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is part of the carbon cycle, an important component of the Earth system. The natural carbon cycle is the flow or flux of carbon between the terrestrial biosphere, the trees, grasses, and other vegetation on land, the oceans, and the atmosphere. By carbon here, I mean both carbon dioxide, CO2, and methane, CH4. The natural carbon fluxes are very large. On land, the fluxes are driven by photosynthesis, the process by which plants remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as they grow in the presence of light, and respiration, as the plants and soils release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. The balance between the photosynthesis and respiration fluxes drive the characteristic diurnal and seasonal variation of atmospheric CO2. Other land-based fluxes come from wetlands and soils, which have seasonal variability. Oceans exchange carbon with the atmosphere over longer timescales. These fluxes are roughly in balance in the natural carbon cycle. Humans, however, have been perturbing the natural carbon cycle by burning fossil fuels, other industrial processes, and altering our use of the land, for example, clear-cutting, agriculture, and urbanization. These perturbations are small compared with the total magnitude of the natural carbon cycle fluxes, but because the natural carbon cycle fluxes nearly balance, this human perturbation becomes very important. We see the imprint of human activities readily in the measurements of atmospheric composition. This is another way of looking at the problem. Fossil fuels and industrial processes account for almost 90% of the sources of carbon released to the atmosphere, with the remainder stemming from land use change. The three places where the carbon can remain once released are the atmosphere, the terrestrial biosphere, and the oceans. These are called the carbon sinks. Because carbon dioxide and methane are both long-lived gases, they build up in the atmosphere over time. Methane has an atmospheric lifetime of about 12 years, and carbon dioxide's atmospheric lifetime is much longer, perhaps 100 years. I mentioned already that the fluxes from the natural carbon cycle are large, but that on an annual average, the natural carbon cycle is largely in balance. In this figure from the recent carbon budget published in 2021, the authors show that the human influences are increasing. Time begins in 1850 on the left of the figure and moves towards the present day along the x-axis. Positive fluxes are emissions or sources of carbon to the atmosphere, and negative fluxes are the sinks. Fossil fuels and land use change fluxes are positive, and the oceans, land and atmospheric components show negative fluxes. This figure nicely illustrates the variability of the problem. The sinks provided by the terrestrial biosphere, in light green and labeled land on this graph, vary widely from one year to the next. So if we are interested in assessing the human impacts on the carbon cycle, our measurements of atmospheric carbon must be precise and accurate enough to measure small perturbations on large fluxes with significant interannual variability. There are other mysteries of the carbon cycle yet to be understood. You might recall from the previous slide that the oceans and terrestrial biosphere continue to somehow keep up with rising emissions. To describe this more quantitatively, we can define the airborne fraction of carbon dioxide as the ratio between the atmospheric growth rate, which is how much more carbon dioxide has been added to the atmosphere each year, and the total annual emissions. This atmospheric growth rate has remained roughly constant at about half since measurements began. Essentially, this means that for every 4 molecules of carbon dioxide that enter the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels, 2 of those molecules remain in the atmosphere, 1 is absorbed by the oceans, and 1 is absorbed by the terrestrial biosphere. We don't know exactly why the airborne fraction is 1/2 and when that might change. Another mystery is to identify the regional or sub-regional sources and sinks of carbon dioxide and methane. Over the past decade, we've made significant progress in identifying some of the large source and sink regions, but now we wish to identify more precisely which facilities or regions emit, how much, why, and how to stop it. We want to know what the role of forests will be in the future and what the underlying mechanisms are to cause these changes. What will be the role of fires, drought, or increased greening of land previously too cold to support vegetation? To answer these questions, we require high-quality atmospheric measurements. The fluxes of carbon from the terrestrial biosphere and oceans flow through the atmosphere, making the atmosphere an ideal place to search for answers. The global carbon budget is shown in the schematic on the right-hand side of the slide, and most of the fluxes cycle with the atmosphere on various timescales. Because of the nature of the carbon cycle, with small human-caused perturbations atop large, well-balanced natural fluxes that vary significantly from one year to the next, long-term measurements, that is multi-decadal time series, are crucial. Furthermore, both carbon dioxide and methane are potent greenhouse gases, and together they are responsible for most of the energy imbalance that's causing our planet to warm. We've been recording near-surface concentrations of carbon dioxide since 1958, when Charles David Keeling at Scripps Institution of Oceanography first began his measurements atop Mauna Loa in Hawaii. That carbon dioxide record is shown on the left-hand graph on the slide, and the time beginning in 1958 until the present is indicated on the x-axis. The y-axis shows the concentration of carbon dioxide in units of parts per million, or micromoles of carbon dioxide per mole of air. The red line shows the monthly mean values, and the black line is the annual average. You can clearly see the influence of the terrestrial biosphere and the seasonal cycle of the red curve. The curve descends in the northern hemisphere spring when the growing season in the northern mid-latitudes begins, and after the growing season ends, respiration dominates over photosynthesis, releasing carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. The seasonal pattern is on top of a slow long-term increase caused by the buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from human activities. The plot on the right-hand side is the global monthly mean methane concentrations near the surface. It shows a much less monotonic increase over time, with a hiatus period in the methane growth rate between about 1999 and 2007. A seasonal cycle in methane is apparent as well, but it is driven by its main chemical sink, the hydroxyl radical, and by seasonal emissions, for example, from wetlands. It appears that the long-term increase in methane has accelerated since around 2015. No scientific consensus has yet emerged to explain either the hiatus or the recent acceleration. The measurements I just showed are part of a global in situ network which forms the gold standard measurement network for carbon dioxide and methane. This network comprises surface, tower, aircraft, and high-altitude balloon measurements, and the measurements are highly precise and accurate. The measurements are carefully calibrated to the World Meteorological Organization's trace gas standard scale, which is good to about 1/10 of a part per million, or 0.025% in carbon dioxide, and 2 parts per billion, or 0.1% in methane. The network has established a long-term, multi-decadal, high-quality record and has been extremely valuable for understanding the carbon cycle as well as we do. In situ networks are limited in their spatial coverage for many reasons, including practical ones like site access and maintenance. To obtain global coverage, it is often necessary to go to space. Space-based measurements are fundamentally different from in situ measurements. They must use remote sensing techniques to measure through the entire atmosphere to obtain information about concentrations near the surface where the sources and sinks are. Almost all the currently orbiting satellites that measure carbon dioxide and methane do so by measuring reflected sunlight off the Earth's surface. So sunlight passes down through the atmosphere, reflects off the surface, and passes back through the atmosphere again before being measured by the satellite instrument. Each time sunlight passes through the atmosphere, it encounters atmospheric molecules, including carbon dioxide and methane, that absorb certain wavelengths. It is the reduction of sunlight at these wavelengths that reaches the satellite that provides information about the atmospheric abundances of carbon dioxide and methane. From space, with the current generation of instrumentation, it is difficult to distinguish the altitude at which the light is absorbed, so we typically get information about the total column of the trace gas from the surface up to the top of the atmosphere. Of course, it is important that we can compare satellite-based remote sensing measurements of carbon dioxide and methane to the highly precise and accurate in situ network. That is, it is important for the satellite and in situ measurement scales to be the same. To do this, a transfer standard is required, and this role is filled by the Total Carbon Column Observing Network, or TCON, a ground-based remote sensing network of instruments that measure direct sunlight after it passes through the atmosphere. The TCON is comprised of over 26 stations worldwide, and it is designed to measure globally consistent, precise, and accurate total column amounts of carbon dioxide, methane, carbon monoxide, nitrous oxide, water vapor, HDO, and HF. Many sites have added longer wavelength detectors that can simultaneously measure other interesting carbon cycle relevant trace gases like ethane, acetylene, carbonyl sulfide, hydrogen cyanide, propane, and a host of other species. The network's objectives are to constrain global fluxes of carbon and improve our understanding of the carbon cycle, and particularly the role humans have played in perturbing it. We also provide crucial validation datasets for the currently orbiting satellite programs, such as Japan's Greenhouse Gases Observing Satellites, GOSAT and GOSAT-2, NASA's Orbiting Carbon Observatories, OCO2 and OCO3, China's TANSAT and TANSAT-2, and Europe's Tropospheric Monitoring Instrument, TROPOMI. We are very excited about the new TCON station in the Yucatan Peninsula that is currently being set up and operated at UNAM, and if all things go well, will be shipped to the Mayan Biosphere Reserve in the coming months. This new TCON station fills a very important gap in the TCON measurement coverage and will be crucial for tropical carbon cycle monitoring and satellite validation in the coming years. At the heart of each TCON station lies a Fourier transform spectrometer coupled to a solar tracker. Almost all stations use a Bruker 125HR instrument because it is the only commercially available spectrometer we are aware of that satisfies the TCON requirements for stability, repeatability, spectral resolution, and spectral range. Each instrument is run at around 0.02 wave number spectral resolution, or 45 centimeter maximum optical path difference, which is the resolution at which the signal-to-noise and spectral resolution trade-off is optimized for the carbon dioxide band we use. The standard TCON spectral range covers the shortwave infrared region from 3,800 wave numbers to around 12,000 wave numbers, which is about 0.8 to 2.6 microns. This is achieved using a room temperature in-gas detector coupled with a calcium fluoride beam splitter. The spectral range for this setup is shown in the spectrum plot on the right-hand side of the slide, with wave number increasing from the left to the right of the figure. The y-axis represents arbitrary radiance in units proportional to photons per second per meter squared per steradian per wave number, as the TCON spectra are uncalibrated. Most TCON stations employ a second detector, either to cover the near-infrared range up to 15,000 wave numbers, or 0.67 microns, or the mid-infrared range down to 1,800 wave numbers, or 5.5 microns. For the TCON to achieve its goal of producing globally consistent retrievals of atmospheric trace gases, we need to ensure that each station is run in as similar a configuration as possible. The main instrument is therefore assembled with optical components that are as similar as possible. The software is centrally developed and distributed, and we critically evaluate our own and each other's datasets before they are publicly released. In order to improve the precision of our measurements, we employ a technique first proposed by Wallace and Livingston in their 1990 paper. We measure the trace gas of interest, say carbon dioxide, and we also simultaneously measure the oxygen column. We then take the ratio of the column of carbon dioxide to the column of oxygen and multiply by the total column of oxygen, about 21%. The resulting quantity is labeled xCO2 and is the column average dry air mole fraction of CO2. Because the atmospheric oxygen profile and its total column are well known, computing the ratio provides several advantages. It significantly reduces errors that are common to the gas of interest and oxygen. These errors can be related to tracking the sun slightly off-center or other small misalignments in the instrument. This method directly produces a dry air mole fraction, as both carbon dioxide and oxygen are measured in the wet atmosphere. Dry air mole fractions are also produced by the in situ measurements, making them more directly comparable. This ratioing technique results in a much higher precision measurement than the unratioed columns, allowing us to detect clear signatures of CO2 reduction over the course of a summer's day, as shown in the figure on the right. The x-axis of this figure is the solar azimuth angle, so 180 degrees, indicated by the gray vertical line, is local noon. Morning is to the left of the gray line, and afternoon is to the right. The red squares are from measurements recorded in the summer, and the blue circles are from measurements recorded in the winter. This figure shows the time series of the TCON carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and methane records since the network's inception in 2004. The colors represent the total column value, with blue colors indicating lower values and red colors indicating higher values. The x-axis is the time, and the y-axes are the latitudes of the TCON stations. The slow secular increase in CO2 over time is apparent, with the seasonal cycle emerging in the northern hemisphere. Carbon monoxide shows strong seasonal and episodic enhancements and a strong north-south gradient. Methane shows the rapid recent increase in the northern hemisphere and significant seasonality as well. I wanted to take the opportunity to show you one of those episodic carbon monoxide time series figures in a bit more detail. You might have heard in the news about the Canadian wildfires that are currently raging across the country, and we can clearly see them in our data records. On the left plot, I'm showing the time series of carbon monoxide from the East Trout Lake TCON station, which is located in northern Saskatchewan in the Canadian boreal forest. This record shows the impacts of the annual forest fires that take place in Western Canada and how much more severe it has been so far this year than in other years in the record. Not only did the fires start significantly earlier in the season than usual, the total amount of carbon monoxide we measured is the largest we've recorded since the record began in late 2016. The map on the right shows the location of the current fires raging in the region. The red dots show fires that are out of control, yellow are being held, blue are under control. This will unfortunately be a record-setting wildfire season in Canada. Making remote sensing measurements of carbon dioxide is challenging. Not only do we need very high precision and accuracy because the signals of interest are small perturbations on large variable fluxes, but the variations in carbon dioxide in the total column are much smaller than those near the surface. This is illustrated by the figure on the right-hand side of the slide that shows modeled CO2 concentration on the x-axis and the pressure on the y-axis, starting from 1,000 hectopascal at the surface up to the top of the atmosphere. Each line represents a local noon profile of CO2, that is, the variation in CO2 as a function of pressure. These profiles were created for a location in boreal Canada. The colors represent the month of the year. I've plotted this as a function of pressure because the pressure represents the mass of the overhead atmosphere, and the total columns that we compute can be thought of as the mass weighted average of carbon dioxide through the atmosphere. You can see clearly in this figure the seasonal cycle in carbon dioxide, with winter months showing high carbon dioxide near the surface and growing season months showing lower carbon dioxide near the surface. The seasonal variability is much smaller as you move up in the atmosphere. The total column, being the mass-weighted average of the profile, therefore has much less seasonal variability than the surface, tower, or aircraft measurements would detect. On top of that, remote sensing retrievals rely on spectroscopic information about the interactions of light in the atmosphere, good meteorological information about the atmospheric state at the time of the measurement, and excellent maintenance of the optical instrumentation used to make these measurements. Despite these challenges, there are scientific advantages to measuring the total column. The profile of carbon dioxide is affected by plant photosynthesis, which removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, respiration, which releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, and other emissions of carbon dioxide from, for example, fossil fuel burning. The profile is also affected by the vertical transport that can redistribute carbon dioxide vertically within the column, and advection, moving the carbon dioxide around the world. The interplay of these processes causes carbon dioxide profiles to vary diurnally and seasonally. On the previous slide, I showed the seasonal variation in carbon dioxide profiles over boreal Canada, with higher carbon dioxide near the surface during the winter and lower carbon dioxide near the surface in the summer. A similar effect can be seen diurnally, as illustrated in this animation, which was made using tower measurements collected by NOAA at Park Falls, Wisconsin in July 2004. The x-axis is the carbon dioxide concentration, and the y-axis is the altitude. This particular tower is about 400 meters high. Starting at midnight local time, large near-surface concentrations are measured that drop rapidly with altitude. Overnight, carbon dioxide is respired by the local vegetation, but these emissions are constrained to a very thin layer near the surface, called the boundary layer, resulting in large concentrations. As dawn breaks and sunlight becomes available, two things happen. First, the carbon dioxide concentrations near the surface drop rapidly as photosynthesis begins, and second, the height of the boundary layer increases as vertical mixing increases. The boundary layer thickness typically increases until mid-afternoon and can extend above the height of the tower. From surface measurements, one might infer a large nighttime flux of CO2 to the atmosphere and modest daytime photosynthetic uptake of CO2, but it is in fact the opposite. The total amount of carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere during the day at this time of year and location is significantly larger than the nighttime release of CO2 put back into the atmosphere. Measurements of the total column, however, are insensitive to the boundary layer height, and therefore more directly proportional to the underlying fluxes. This figure shows the time series of 2 p.m. surface in situ measurements of carbon dioxide at the Tall Tower in Park Falls, Wisconsin, marked in the black dots. I've chosen 2 p.m. because that is when the boundary layer is typically well developed. I've overlaid the daily median total column measurements collected by the Park Falls TCON station that's sited next to the tower in red. This illustrates that the near surface measurements have a much larger seasonal dynamic range, but that they both show similar phasing in the seasonal cycle and similar long-term trends. One of the main roles of the TCON is to provide a transfer standard between the calibrated surface in situ network and the satellite measurements. To achieve this, we collect atmospheric profiles over our TCON stations and compare our retrieved total columns with the column averaged atmospheric profiles. The figure I've shown here is from one of the Hyper Pole-to-Pole, or HIPPO, flights in 2008 and 2009, and this aircraft used missed approaches and spirals over several TCON stations to provide these profiles. The profiles are shown in the bottom figures, and those profiles are mass averaged or integrated to produce a total column that's comparable with our ground-based TCON measurements. This has now been done using Aircraft and Aircore, a clever high-altitude balloon-based measurement system, around 80 times for CO2 and around 30 times for methane at more than 10 individual TCON stations. We also have collected carbon monoxide, water vapor, and nitrous oxide profiles as well. On the plots on this slide, the x-axis represents the in-situ total columns that are calibrated to the WMO trace gas standard scale, and on the y-axis are the retrieved TCON values. You can see that while there is excellent correlation between the TCON and in-situ measurements, there is an offset in the slopes from the dotted 1-to-1 line. These offsets are then removed from the TCON results, placing the TCON measurements on the WMO trace gas scale. This allows the TCON measurements to serve as the transfer standard between the satellite measurements and the in-situ measurements. Now that the TCON data are tied to the trace gas standard scale, they can be used for satellite validation. Because the TCON measures the total atmospheric column, which is the same quantity measured from the satellites, it is reasonably straightforward to compare coincident measurements. The satellites often have special target modes designed to collect as many measurements as possible over the TCON stations, and we use these coincident measurements to evaluate and remove biases from the satellite measurements. The figure on the right shows a recent comparison between TCON measurements and coincident measurements from NASA's Orbiting Carbon Observatory 2. This kind of agreement gives us confidence that the satellite measurements are accurate and precise, and we are constantly improving the measurement techniques and retrievals. In the past decade or so, significant energy and resources have been put into making the most precise and accurate measurements possible of carbon dioxide and methane from space. In the next few slides, I will describe some of the successes and challenges of these observing systems. On the slide, you can see an artist's rendering of the Orbiting Carbon Observatory 2 satellite. On this graph, I'm showing the past, present, and future of carbon monitoring from space. The trailblazer in carbon monitoring was Skiamaki on Envisat, which measured carbon dioxide, methane, and many other trace gas species from 2002 until 2012. GOSAT, launched in 2009, was the first satellite to successfully reach orbit that was designed specifically to measure carbon dioxide and methane to high precision, and its follow-on mission, GOSAT-2, was launched in 2018. OCO2 was launched in 2014, which measures carbon dioxide but not methane, and was followed by OCO3 that's currently on the International Space Station. TANSAT is very similar in design to OCO2. TROPOMI on the Sentinel-5P measures methane and carbon monoxide, but not carbon dioxide. All of the currently orbiting satellites are in low Earth orbits and, except for TROPOMI, take several days to obtain complete global coverage. TROPOMI obtains daily global coverage. The future of carbon monitoring looks very bright, with several near-future launches planned. CO2M, for example, will be a 2 or 3 satellite constellation that should get us much closer to mapping CO2 and methane around the world in a few days. This animation shows the first year or so of measurements from NASA's Orbiting Carbon Observatory 2, or OCO2. You can see the individual stripes of measurements appear at first, and then as the video progresses, the measurements build up to provide a global view of carbon dioxide. OCO2 is able to obtain measurements over regions of the world where we have never been able to measure before, especially in the tropics and the southern hemisphere. We still cannot resolve all the complexity we can model, for example, how carbon dioxide advects or flows across the planet. This is because OCO2, like all current carbon dioxide satellites, measures different places on Earth each day. When planned future missions are launched, we will hopefully be able to fill in many of these measurement gaps. I will give you a few seconds to watch as the carbon dioxide measurements build up over a year, and then, on the following slides, I will give you a brief and incomplete look at the new tools and discoveries made using the OCO2 data. Starting from the point source scale, colleagues at Environment and Climate Change Canada, led by Dr. Ray Nasser, have found a robust way of computing emissions from individual power plants using OCO2 data. The left-hand image shows the OCO2 data in the colored stripe downwind of a large power plant in India. The enhancement in carbon dioxide from the power plant's plume is shown in the second plot from the left. Nasser et al. Then used these data together with a plume model to estimate emissions from the power plant. They have now characterized 20 power plants and related facilities in the United States, India, South Africa, Poland, Russia, and South Korea. They have shown that these satellite measurements are helpful not only for quantifying emissions, but also for monitoring changes in the emissions. Continued space-based measurements of these facilities will be crucial for evaluating the impacts of emissions reduction efforts and policies. Moving up to larger scales, Dr. Jana Hakkarainen and colleagues have demonstrated that satellites like OCO2 are capable of identifying regional signals of carbon dioxide emissions. The figure on this slide shows OCO2 data averaged over the 2015 to 2018 period. To generate this figure, the authors subtracted the mean value at a given latitude from all data at that latitude. This technique reveals the underlying pattern of emissions. In the figure, yellow colors indicate higher emissions and bluer colors indicate lower emissions than the average at that latitude. The locations of these emissions are consistent with regions known to produce large fossil fuel and biomass burning emissions. This sort of analysis can provide information on where country scale or larger emissions reduction efforts have been successful. Finally, on even larger scales, Dr. Junji Liu and colleagues were able to use OCO2 data in an assimilation, which is a data-driven model, to figure out where the excess carbon dioxide was coming from during the strong 2015-2016 El Niño event. More importantly, they discovered why the excess carbon dioxide was released into the atmosphere. El Niño events are driven by a weakening of the easterly trade winds in the equatorial Pacific Ocean, causing increased surface temperatures and changes in precipitation patterns throughout the globe. These El Niño events are also known to correspond with increased atmospheric carbon dioxide. This study was particularly interesting and exciting because it used 3 satellite products to reach its conclusions: carbon dioxide from OCO2, carbon monoxide from a Canadian satellite called Measurements of Pollution in the Troposphere, or MOPIT, and a product called solar-induced chlorophyll fluorescence, also from OCO2. Solar-induced chlorophyll fluorescence is a byproduct of photosynthesis. When plants photosynthesize, some of the waste energy is expelled as fluorescence photons. These fluorescence photons can be detected by spectrometers like OCO2 in space, providing us with a new way to measure photosynthesis on ecosystem and larger scales. Carbon monoxide measurements from MOPIT help track fires, which produce both carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. With these 3 products together, Dr. Liu discovered that in the 2015-2016 El Niño event, the increased carbon emissions over the land came primarily from the 3 tropical forest regions in South America, Africa, and Indonesia. Curiously, in each region, the increase in carbon had a different cause. In South America, droughts caused a decline in photosynthesis. In Africa, hotter than normal temperatures increased plant decomposition, and in Indonesia, droughts caused increased fire activity. I want to shift gears a little bit now to combine all these measurement types to describe my group's multi-scale approach to estimating carbon emissions from the Greater Toronto Area, the largest urban centre in Canada. The graphic I'm showing was created by Sabrina Madsen to illustrate our approach. We want to evaluate urban emissions and urban forest carbon sequestration, and we do this using several measurement techniques, including a mobile in situ lab pulled by a bicycle, ground-based remote sensing, and satellite remote sensing. But first, I want to explain why we are so interested in cities. Urban areas in North America are an important source of carbon emissions to the atmosphere. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions within cities is important not only for our climate, but also for air quality, since many of the activities that produce greenhouse gases also produce pollutants. For the last part of my talk today, I will tell you briefly about our work on quantifying and monitoring the greenhouse gas emissions within the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. The Greater Toronto and Hamilton area include the City of Toronto, together with Hamilton, Halton, Peel, York, and Durham regions. It is Canada's most populous metropolitan area, with around 7 million inhabitants, or just under 20% of the population of Canada. Toronto City Council has adopted an ambitious strategy to reduce community-wide greenhouse gas emissions in Toronto to net zero by 2040. This is 10 years earlier than they initially proposed. The city's 2040 target is one of the most ambitious in North America. The plans include promoting and expanding public transit, expanding urban green spaces, and making buildings more efficient by, for example, switching to heat pumps instead of natural gas or oil heating. As part of their plan, however, there is no mention of atmospheric monitoring to confirm that these policies have the desired effect on the atmosphere. Emissions are typically reported to governments and intergovernmental groups like the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change using what we call bottom-up inventories. These are accounting systems where industries and businesses report their emissions to a group, like the Atmospheric Fund in Toronto, that combines the information together into a report. For example, a farmer who cares for dairy cows will calculate their methane emissions based on a standard emission factor for each cow and multiply that number by the number of cows in the herd. Inventories are incredibly useful because they are actionable. If we know what sector and what component the emissions are coming from, we can regulate or apply other means to reduce the emissions. The challenge with inventories is that unknown emissions are not included. It is therefore very important to verify and improve inventories using atmospheric measurements. However, existing inventories for the GTA don't break down emissions by gas, which makes it very hard to monitor from atmospheric measurements. The best emissions inventory we have for carbon dioxide in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area is from the work of Dr. Stephanie Pugliese and her colleagues at the University of Toronto and Environment and Climate Change Canada. Dr. Pugliese's inventory is shown in the figure on the left. The inset box on this figure shows the GTHA, and on this figure, warmer or redder colors indicate higher emissions, and cooler or bluer colors indicate lower emissions. These detailed emissions were derived from measurements made in the wintertime to avoid complications associated with biospheric contributions, essentially from plant growth in the growing season. Toronto has a lot of trees, so to create a CO2 emission inventory for growing season months, we need to accurately quantify the amount of carbon dioxide removed from Toronto's atmosphere by those trees and other plants through photosynthesis. Recent developments in producing solar-induced chlorophyll fluorescence products from satellites have now provided the first step we need to assess carbon dioxide emissions throughout the year. The image on the right shows the solar-induced chlorophyll fluorescence signal over 2 weeks in June 2019, measured by the tropospheric monitoring instrument. Light yellow colors indicate higher signals and therefore more photosynthetic activity than the darker blue colors. The best methane inventory that we have for the region was developed by then PhD student Nazreen Pak, and it is called the Facility Level and Area Methane Emissions Inventory, or FLAME. This inventory includes all known point and area sources within the city, compiled from municipal reports and scientific studies. It is this inventory that we use to guide our atmospheric measurements of methane within the city, and as we add measurements and evaluate the emissions, the inventory will be updated. The FLAME inventory can be gridded in order to provide accurate emissions for high-resolution models. Armed with these detailed inventories, we have set out to develop an atmospheric monitoring system within the city to identify and quantify point source emissions, observe and monitor city-scale emissions, and place our city's emissions into a more global context. To identify and quantify point sources, we use mobile in situ techniques. To observe and monitor city-scale emissions, we use ground-based remote sensing, and to place our city's emissions into a global context, we make use of satellite measurements. First, I will describe our mobile in situ measurements. Since around 2017, we have been collecting mobile data from a bicycle-pulled cargo trailer that contains an in situ multi-gas analyzer. We also collaborate with Environment and Climate Change Canada, who uses a truck instead of a bicycle. The analyzer can measure methane, carbon dioxide, and water vapor. We design our routes to survey inventoried emitters and sampled uncatalogued emitters. This is an example of one of our surveys from 2021. You can see the whole map on the left and an animation of the route on the right. On the right, the red curtain shows the concentration of methane that was measured by the height of the curtain. The very big enhancement that you will see in a few seconds is from Kings Mill Park, which is now a public park with some residential and commercial land use, but was formerly a landfill which opened in 1959 and was closed in 1964. These sorts of measurements are very helpful to identify the locations of methane emissions within the city. Compiling all the surveys we've collected over the past few years, we can generate maps like these to show where enhancements of methane are typically observed throughout the city. Green indicates where we've measured but have not observed enhanced methane. Yellow, orange, and red indicate where we see persistent small, medium, and large enhancements respectively. You can see that there are a few locations with large enhancements and more widespread small and medium enhancements. We often see large enhancements near the lakeshore. In a paper published in 2020, Dr. Sebastian Ars took a close look at 3 source types: landfills, which are marked in brown on the map, natural gas compressor stations, which are marked in gray on the map, and an engineered waterway that's marked in blue. Using a Gaussian plume dispersion model, Dr. Ars inferred emission rates from each of these sources. We learned that the flame inventory has overestimated landfill emissions and likely underestimated compressor station emissions. The compressor station emissions are particularly difficult to properly quantify from short surveys like these because the emissions tend to be episodic, and it is often just luck that allows us to sample a flaring or venting event from these stations. The Keating Channel is an engineered waterway in Toronto that prevents the Don River from emptying directly into Lake Ontario. This kind of emission source is not included in the inventories at all, but we see very persistent enhancements from it. And now that we have a method to assess individual point sources of methane, we need another technique to assess citywide emissions, and that's where remote sensing comes in. The idea with our ground-based remote sensing observing system is to place the spectrometers upwind and downwind of the city, regardless of wind direction. Then enhancements in the downwind measurements relative to the upwind measurements provides a proxy for city-scale emissions. This is similar to the mass balance approaches used with aircraft measurements around sources of interest, but it allows us to monitor these enhancements on every sunny day. In Toronto, we have installed ground-based spectrometers, called EM27 SUNS, in the white domes you see in the images at 4 locations throughout the city: in Mississauga to the west, Scarborough to the east, Environment and Climate Change Canada in the north, and our downtown University of Toronto campus in the south. We have also installed one of these instruments much further north outside of the city to monitor background methane, carbon dioxide, and carbon monoxide. You can see on the bottom left an example of the first few years of the time series from one of these instruments of methane, CO2, and carbon monoxide. This remote sensing mass balance approach has been used in the past in Los Angeles and also in Europe to assess emissions of methane. In these studies, enhancement ratios of carbon dioxide, methane, and carbon monoxide were computed. The enhancement ratios themselves provide us with information about the source of emissions, for example, how efficiently vehicle engines burn in a given city, or how well catalytic converters are performing. The enhancement ratios can also provide a method of computing emissions directly. To calculate emissions from enhancement ratios, you need to know the emissions of one of the trace gases of interest. That is, you need to have confidence in the reported inventory emissions. In the example shown here, I'm computing the enhancement ratio of methane to carbon monoxide. These data were collected in Los Angeles, and the carbon monoxide inventory in Los Angeles is very well known because they had an extensive tailpipe measurement system to accurately quantify carbon monoxide emissions from the vehicle fleet. We used the inventory emissions of carbon monoxide to infer the emissions of methane from the Los Angeles area, showing that the emissions of methane were significantly underestimated by the inventories. The initial data from our remote sensing spectrometers in Toronto is promising, and it shows that we are able to detect significant enhancements from the city. As we build up longer time series, we will be able to use these enhancements to compare with the inventories and to compute emissions. More importantly, with this permanent observatory, we will be able to quantify not just emissions today, but changes in emissions over time as new policies come into effect. This kind of observing system should be able to provide important feedback on how effective the city's policies are. The final piece of our city monitoring system is to use satellite measurements to put Toronto's emissions into a global context. It is first important to ensure that the satellites that measure over our city are accurate and precise, so we use the ground-based measurements in the city to help validate the satellite measurements, just as I did with the TCON measurements earlier in this talk. On this figure, I'm showing measurements from an OCO2 target over Toronto to give you a sense of the data density we get from the satellite, and 3 figures showing very encouraging relationships between our ground-based measurements and the satellite measurements. In the top right, I'm showing carbon dioxide from OCO3 and from OCO2 in the bottom left plot. The bottom right plot is a comparison of methane from Tropomi to our ground-based spectrometers. Armed with this confidence, we can now compare enhancements from satellites in cities around the world. To compute urban emissions from space, Our approach is to start by computing enhancements of various trace gas species measured by different satellites over a city and relate them to each other to compute enhancement ratios. For example, we can compute the ratio of carbon dioxide enhancements over a city to the enhancements of carbon monoxide over the same city. To do this with the current suite of satellites, however, we need to match the satellites together, and this is a challenging task because the viewing geometries of each satellite differ markedly. OCO2 takes thin strips of measurements with high spatial resolution throughout the planet. I'm showing this in the figure on the left. OCO3 takes area maps of cities of interest, that's shown in the middle, and TRPOMI covers the globe each day with a 5 kilometer by 3.5 kilometer footprint, and that's shown on the right-hand side. These are all measurements over Toronto, and together we can relate the enhancements from the city from CO2, NO2, CO, and methane to each other. Then we can turn to other cities around the world to compare the enhancements between cities and to models that use inventories to generate their atmospheric concentrations. Here I'm including an example from Los Angeles, a basin city with significant levels of pollution. The city borders are outlined in white in the figure on the left. That plot shows a satellite image of the region with a thin OCO2 strip of measurements running through the city. The wind direction is indicated by the magenta arrow, and it shows an onshore breeze, pushing polluted air into the city where it's trapped by the mountains to the north and east. On the right-hand plot, the OCO2 measurements of CO2 are shown on the x-axis as a function of latitude on the y-axis. You can clearly see the enhancement in carbon dioxide over the city that's indicated in red. We can calculate enhancements of carbon monoxide in the city as well using TRPOMI measurements. Since TRPOMI obtains global coverage each day, we can calculate enhancements over a larger area. If we calculate the enhancements of several trace gases, we can look at the correlations between the enhancements. Our first look at these values compared with the accepted literature values in Los Angeles are very promising. All the enhancement ratios that we measure agree well with the known values. This gives us confidence to use this analysis technique for cities around the world. Turning to 21 cities worldwide, we can perform the same analyses and compare our enhancement ratios to those from the inventories. Our results suggest that the measured CO to CO2 enhancement ratios are larger than the inventory ratios, suggesting that either the inventories estimate too little carbon monoxide or too much carbon dioxide. Repeating this analysis for NO2 and CO2, we see that the inventory enhancement ratios agree reasonably well with what is measured by the satellites, suggesting that perhaps the carbon monoxide inventories could be systematically underestimated by the inventories. This has been suggested by other papers in the past as well, and it is nice to see that there's some confirmation of this problem. This kind of analysis will help us evaluate the inventories on city scales and allow us to compare different cities and their emission reduction policy effectiveness. To further these results, we will also need to build up an inversion model that can resolve city scales, accurately estimate the carbon sequestration from urban forests, and use atmospheric measurements to refine the inventories. This talk is focused on using atmospheric measurements to understand key questions about the carbon cycle, and in particular the role of remote sensing both from the ground and from space to collect these crucial measurements. The in-situ networks remain an important part of the suite of atmospheric measurements as they can be calibrated and are more precise and accurate than the remote sensing measurements and can be used to identify point sources. The role of satellites is to obtain the full global coverage that is prohibitively difficult to do from the ground, and to continually make higher quality measurements at smaller and smaller spatial and temporal scales. The satellites and in-situ networks must be linked through a transfer standard, and that is a role currently filled by the TCON and other ground-based networks. We use all of these observing techniques to monitor carbon emissions in urban areas like the Greater Toronto Area, and we hope that these kinds of measurements help to inform effective emission reduction policies. I'd like to acknowledge the TCON partners who work tirelessly to maintain high-quality data records and use them to do excellent science, and I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Debra. It was a really excellent talk. And I want now collect the questions. Maybe can you if you want to read question, give me questions, then write them please in the chat. Michelle has a question, maybe you can go directly.
Hi, Debra.
Hi, Michelle.
I on purpose came to the video conference room so I can personally thank you for preparing this excellent talk for us. It was really gives an excellent overview of what the needs are in terms of measurement capabilities and also the importance of the measurements done by the network. I have a comment which probably will convert itself into a question, but well, it is obvious that there has been a shift in terms of what we know of the carbon cycle from specific studies done in sites with in situ measurements, everything that we know until now. And now with the remote sensing and satellite data, we have a more general view of what's going on. The great benefit of the satellite obviously is that we get to see and identify these hotspots. I mean, there's a lot of talk now about these big emitters, and we can, the satellites, identify these. And I think this is absolutely great because we can do and promote action into reducing emissions with these techniques. On the other hand, the ground-based measurements are important because satellites will come and go, and technology will evolve, and retrievals will improve. But we need, like you said, we need a standard. And this is very important, and to intercalibrate the different missions and so on. But also in terms of doing, satellite gives us an overview, but if we want to understand what's going on with the perturbation in the ecosystem, what is it due to, we don't really know. So for that reason, I think it is really important that we continue with this in situ complementary studies like what we are proposing in Yucatan to also have a flux tower and do some sampling of soil, vegetation, and understand really what the perturbations are caused by. So there's a very important parameter that you mentioned is this fluorescent signal that some satellites are capturing. I would like to ask you what really the potential is for this parameter to identify the stresses that vegetation is suffering and what the limitations are really in this SIF product that is very promising, but of course, probably has its limitations.
It's a very good question. I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer it, but I'll give it a go. So my understanding of SIF is that it is doing a really good job of being a proxy on regional scales. So perhaps not at the leaf level, but certainly at the ecosystem scale and larger. And so I think it's really powerful for getting a handle on what's happening at those types of scales. But I'm not sure how it will tell you how an individual leaf is reacting to a drought or heat. And so in the study that Junji Liu did, it was several years ago now, I guess it was 2017, she looked at SIF as a proxy for basically the health of the plants and looked for what could explain the decline. And she came up with the proxy. I think it was that there was a reduction in photosynthesis because of the heat. And so I think those are the kinds of studies that are really promising, but at least from satellites, I think the SIF is best used on larger spatial scales. And that's why, you know, with all of these types of measurements, you need to have all of the different types of scales. You need the in situ and the column from the ground and then the column from space.
to get all the different types of scales that you want. I think it's the same thing for SIF. You need some leaf level phenology type understanding near the ground, and then you need these tower instruments to sort of tie that to the satellite, and then the satellite to do the more regional scale stuff. Did that answer your question at all?
Yes, of course. And are there any validation strategies for the SIF product?
Yeah, there are a couple of instruments out of Jochen Stutz's group in UCLA I'm familiar with, and he has a tower-based SIF spectrometer, and I think they've flown them on aircraft as well. And then, of course, there's, you put a leaf inside an instrument and you measure the SIF coming off of that leaf when the presence or, when you give it light. And so I think tying the leaf level to the tower level is the tricky bit at the moment, I believe. And then comparing the tower level to the satellite level is a little more straightforward. That's my understanding at the moment.
Okay.
So lots of work to do still.
Thanks. Back to
you.
There's a question of Sochi. How do you estimate ground emission using remote sensing? As outcome is a column averaged value, is a question. And there's another question, how do you use a vertical profile to approximate the value on ground?
Okay, that's a good question, or two good questions. So how do we estimate ground emissions using remote sensing? Because so you're right. So the ground-based remote sensing measurement measures basically all the molecules from the surface up to the top of the atmosphere, really all the way to the sun. And we don't distinguish between different vertical levels. So we don't do a vertical profile. We've been trying to do that with the TCON measurements for quite some time. It's really tricky. I could give a whole talk on why it's tricky. I'm happy to discuss that, but I won't spend too much time explaining it now. But what we do is we take not just so depending on where you are, you can either use a single set of measurements or you can use multiple measurements. But in the city of Toronto, what we do is we place one ground-based spectrometer upwind and one ground-based spectrometer downwind. And we know that above the boundary layer, which is the first couple kilometers above the surface of the Earth, the CO2 or methane or whatever you're interested in calculating emissions from doesn't change very much, certainly not in the time scale of a few minutes to a few hours. And so what we do is we take the upwind and we subtract off the downwind total column, and we assume that the change that occurs across a city or a point source of interest is entirely due to the emissions from that point source into the boundary layer. And so that's how we get around this problem of measuring the total column. I hope that answers your question, but if it doesn't, feel free to add another question into the into the chat.
Thank you, Debra. I think it was a really good answer. And Carlos Guy asked, thank you for your very illustrative presentation. And he asked, could we use our data to collaborate with you?
Sure.
Yes, sure. Yeah.
Sounds good.
And yeah, so they are not, I don't see more questions maybe in the other channels, or no.
Las personas que estén en YouTube o Facebook también pueden mandar.
People on Facebook or on YouTube, you can also send your questions.
Okay. No, but maybe. So maybe if there are no more questions, I would thank you again. It was really, really nice talk, and I think we all learned a lot. And I think there's a small interview afterwards. No, And ja, genau, doy el palabra a Jorge. Jorge, el director.
So now I give the floor to our director, Jorge. Thank you very much. It has been a very interesting talk. There are different aspects that, of course, we might think in our city, in our big city, in our city, Mexico City and other cities. We may have methods and techniques. Some of them are being applied, but some others would give us a lot of opportunities. And we hope that we can get a lot of cooperation with you, Debra. I want to also thank you very much for your very interesting talk, and certainly our students and professors will keep close communication and cooperation with you. In a different train of ideas, tomorrow, we will have the talk of Dr. David Broden. He will be physically here in our auditorium. We invite you all to join us, and we remind you that this talk, as well as all other talks that we will have this week, will be recorded for your so you can check in the social digital networks, as we call them today. And we will also have a small capsules to offer a synthesis or a summary. And that would be great because people would see those capsules and then would move them to go to look for the whole presentation. Because again, the people who may have had the chance to listen that, or may want to go back to revisit some aspects that they want to see in further detail. So we thank you a lot, and we invite you tomorrow to be with us. And you will be able to get connected through this Zoom application or through our social media. Those of you from the social media, or if you have the chance, please come to our auditorium. Thank you very much.
Could you wait some minutes?